Hello, in this Dev Snippet, I'm going to take a look at how created the effects that you can see here for the player and the enemies in my recent Bridget and Riley inspired game My Poor Retinas. So you can see the effect is it's distorting what's actually under the player character, and you can see this other character that's coming in and they're distorting a much larger area. So it's both distorting and also tinting the environment that it's around. So let's take a look at how this is actually working. So there's a few different ways that you could actually approach doing this. So one of the options would be to make use of a shader where you're using a capture of the actual environment and then distorting that individually for each particular character and then applying the individual tints to that. So that would be capturing the screen once, and then each of these characters would actually use an individual shader and would be modifying how it's rendering. Now, the approach that I've gone, because I'm not particularly familiar with shaders and I wanted to develop this in a very short period of time, I adopted an alternate approach. It uses a similar setup to that, but from a performance point of view, this is going to be substantially poorer in performance. So we can see actually what's happening here, in that if we take any of the enemies, well, those enemies are comprised of a mesh. Now that mesh is in this separate layer, it's in this characters layer. And the reason it's in that characters layer is directly above that mesh is a camera set to an orthographic projection. This camera is set so that it can see everything except things in that characters layer. So the camera is able to see through this mesh and is seeing what's under that particular quad. And what that camera is doing is that camera is capturing to a texture. So we're using a process here known as render to texture. So that camera is rendering to a texture, and that texture is then applied onto that quad. Now, because it's all linked to the enemy, it all moves with the enemy. Now, this isn't set up all manually. I actually use a script to drive this. So here's sort of the setup that I've got for the script. So I'm able to configure my render texture. So in terms of its width and height, the depth buffer bits, as well as its format. And I've also then got setups here where I can configure my tint color. I have my setups where I can link to my environment and target renderer. Now in terms of the actual setup code for it, all of that happens in Start. I create my new render to texture. Now I'm saying that it's not a power of 2 because potentially with the sizes it's not. This I could actually be determining based upon my texture width and height, and probably should. There might be performance implications for this, I'm not entirely sure. So once I've set my render texture up, I'm linking that to my camera. Now the distortion material shader, so this actually doesn't apply distortion to it, but this is the material shader that is used for those quads. So this is the material that the texture that is being captured from the camera is fed into. So I'm creating one using shader, and this is actually just using the standard shader. I'm setting its texture. Now because I want it to blend in with the background, with that terrain, there's a couple of things I needed to do. The terrain doesn't have specular highlights, so I was actually turning off those, as well as turning down the glossiness and the metallic color, and then setting the tint. Then all I was doing was setting the material on that mesh to my newly created distortion material. And that then creates this effect. Now to get it so that it's actually doing that distortion, I added onto my camera that's attached to this enemy, there is the fisheye script. So this is from the Unity image effects library, and so I just applied the fisheye and calibrated it. Now we have another enemy, so we also have this enemy Evil Otto. So if I bring Evil Otto into the world and we take a look at their setup, Evil Otto is using a very similar setup. The main difference with Evil Otto is the camera is using a different image effect. That's why when we look at the game with Evil Otto in it, it's doing this. This is that different camera effect. Now, what we can notice is that we can actually see the edges a little bit, in particular for Evil Otto. It doesn't quite blend in fully. And that's in part because of the way that this is doing this, because it's actually re-rendering the terrain. Means that it's very sensitive to the positioning of the camera. You can see that the camera is positioned at 38 here. And so it's very sensitive to that positioning, which is a slightly problematic setup. Long term, a shader would be better in terms of performance and in terms of making these actually more, in terms of making these synchronize better with the terrain. But this is how they were set up. In the description, I'm going to throw in a link to the itch.io page for the game. I do hope you enjoy the game, but it's called My Poor Retinas for a reason. It is going to be potentially something that is less than fun for your eyes to look at. But I do hope you enjoyed the video, and I do hope it's been educational. If you have any questions, then please post a comment below. But until next time, bye.